to the Borders and Backgrounds Challenge. Now that was very early on. It was, I think, my third or fourth challenge. Done several since then, but it's really, really a good one to go back and visit. Now I'm going to be showing you some pictures, and I have a whole PowerPoint presentation about quilting borders because I have some very strong opinions about it. I know, shocking, but you can actually download that if you'd like. There's a link in the description box below, and you can get that free download. So if you want to refer to some of the notes or some of the things I talked about, you can definitely do that. And then at the end of the chat, I'll tell you about this week's deal or promotion that we have going on. So it's going to be a great time. Plus, I have Jessica here kind of monitoring the chat. She's going to write down any questions you might have, and we're just going to try to hit all of the good talking points. So without further ado, let's get right to the presentation. So we're actually not going to be talking specifically about designs. I'm going to talk more about how you approach quilting the borders, because it's definitely one of those areas that you have to think, oh, okay, I gotta pick a design, but I also have to decide how am I going to do it. So as you're going through, I'm going to talk about some of the things that you can think about and the ways that I approach quilting the borders of my quilt. And it just so happens that I am the expert of my opinion, so this is definitely how I do it. So before I even pick any designs for the quilt, I first decide how am I going to approach the border. So this particular quilt, we'll see this at the end when it comes to the promo deal. This is from the Panel Play Midnight Quilter episode. So it's kind of fun that I've had a free motion challenge about borders and then also have a quilt pattern that does that as well. So we're going to talk about the borders and how to approach it. But first, before I pick the design, I need to decide, am I going to quilt the borders all at one time? Am I going to just do it whether it's at the beginning or the end or somewhere in the middle? Once I start the border, just go and not stop? Or am I going to approach it in sections? So does that mean that I'm going to quilt part of the border, come out of it, and then come back in? Now, I just want to stop real quick because there's a little bit of a caveat to this. If you're brand new to machine quilting, you might be thinking, I have a hard enough time just remembering to breathe and remembering not to pee my pants. This is definitely next level, so don't feel like you have to do this right now, but once you feel comfortable with the process, thinking about this will help you kind of take it to the next level or be a little bit more efficient with the quilting. Okay, so if I'm on my sewing machine quilting the quilt, I might decide to do all the border at one time, just because it's easier to get started with that design and keep going. However, when I'm quilting on a long arm, that's not going to necessarily be the case. As I'm working my way across the quilt, I'm going to have sections of the border that I can reach and the rest of it I can't. Now, that's not to say that you can't do either option on either machine, right? If you wanted to, on your long arm, you could wait to the very end and quilt the borders, or on your sewing machine, if you wanted to break it up into chunks, you can do that as well. Now, that's actually how I go about it. I like to quilt my borders in sections, allowing me to quilt a portion of the border, transition into the middle, and then continue on. And that's even the case if I'm on my sewing machine, because I get easily bored of designs, so it allows me to kind of switch it up. But it also lets me handle any part of the quilt when I'm right there. So there's no wrong way to it, but kind of knowing how you're going to do it will help you pick out those designs. Okay, so let's say you decide you're going to do it all at once. You want to start the design, you want to keep going, you don't want to get distracted, you want to get into the flow. Pretty much any design will work because you're doing it continuously, so any kind of design you can pick. But you just have to kind of decide beforehand, do you want this border to be more of a focal element or just a nice kind of frame? Now, it really depends on what's going on in the center of the quilt, right? So in this picture, this is actually the panel from the Echoes and Curves Free Motion Challenge. White noise. I wonder what's, oh, I think it's my fan. So if you're having trouble with the sound, my fan is running on my computer. Let me move my mic over. Maybe that'll sound better. Thanks for pointing that out because I don't want to talk the whole time, right, Jessica, and have it sound really bad. Anyway, so do I want, in this particular quilt, the center bit here is a panel, so it's actually not pieced. It's from our Echoes and Curves Free Motion Challenge, Quilting Along. And, it is really cool, but I thought maybe something a little bit more ornate in the borders could work. Or maybe you have something really cool pieced in the center and you're like, you know what, I don't want to take away from that. I'm going to do something a little bit more textured. That's kind of the things I'm thinking about when I'm picking the designs. Plus, the width of the border definitely plays a big role in that as well. So, I mean, it makes sense, right? If I have a 2-inch border, I'm not going to be able to do a whole big feather in it. So, once I know how I'm going to approach it, if I'm going to do it all at once, I'm going to kind of start picking out the designs and thinking through these kind of things. But if you're going to work in sections, you got to kind of think about the designs a little bit different, right? So if I'm quilting it in sections, I'm going to quilt part of it, transition in and out. So if I'm doing multiple borders like that, I'm going to need designs that touch the edge. So I call them touching designs. This is going to be my transition in and out. Now, if you have a question about that, don't worry. I'm going to kind of address that in a little bit more detail. We're just talking about how you can approach it. So if I'm quilting it in sections, I'm going to need designs that touch the edge, especially if they're multiple borders, or I need to pick designs that can be broken into chunks. So that means a feather, if you look at a beautiful feather, maybe I can't quilt that feather continuously. I'm going to quilt it in chunks. You'll see what I mean here in a second. Or as a third option, I can use the quilting to break up the border into sections. Now I know that all seems kind of crazy. I've got pictures and examples, but just know that this is kind of the crazy things I think of when I'm picking out quilting designs. So let's look at an example of the first one, picking designs that touch for multiple borders. Don't you love medallion quilts? So great, right? You add all those borders and you're like, this is perfect, until it's time to quilt, right? So if I have something like this with lots of thin little borders, first of all, I just don't like piecing borders and I don't really like quilting borders. So when you throw a bunch of them, not always my favorite, but sometimes it has to be done. So here we can see I have several borders. How can I quilt this in sections, right? How can I quilt it so that I can transition in and out instead of having to go all the way around several times? Well, I'm so glad you asked. So I'm going to pick designs that can touch. And let's look at this particular example. I just drew this out real quick. Let's pretend I have 3 borders that I'm going to quilt. And let's pretend I can only reach the top half or a certain section of it. Starting from the left-hand side, I'm going to start quilting my wishbone, which is perfect for those thinner borders. But as I approach the end of my area that I can reach, not the end of the border, right? In this example, the border is going on down the quilt. I'm just getting to where my hands can reach or on my long arm. Once I get to that point, I'm going to run in to the side of the border. So if I'm heading right, I'm going to transition by just running into it and then working my way back up, quilting the ribbon candy. Now, it looks weird right now, and I'm going to eventually hook them all together, but let me tell you, it's not noticeable when it's all said and done, right? And if anybody did notice it, I would just say, oh, it's supposed to be that way. But those designs that touch will help you transition. So I went down, I've hooked over into the next border, now I'm going back up, and then I'm going to continue with my next design, the wishbone again, going to the bottom of the area that I can reach, right? So I've kind of transitioned to the one side, and once I get to the bottom, now let's pretend that I've repositioned the quilt or advanced the machine. I'm going to continue on until I get to the end of the next area. So now I'm pretending I can only reach the bottom half. Now I'm going to be transitioning back this way in this particular example. So I'm going to touch on the left side of the border. So you can see here, I have quilted my wishbones, I've repositioned, I get all the way to the bottom or to the bottom of my area that I can reach, and I'm going to touch the left side. Now I can work my way back up, quilting that ribbon candy, and then hooking in to the same place I transitioned out of. So real quick, I'm going to go backwards so you can see where that ribbon candy starts on the left side. I just quilted it till I got to that point and then hooked right into my wishbone. Now I'm not going to lie, that part is a little tricky. So if you're newer to quilting a design, this is not what you want to do the first time around. But if I can kind of see where I need to hit, where that transition is, I can kind of get it as close as I can. And even if it's not perfect, I mean, you can tell even in the drawing that little wishbone kind of looks a little weird right there. I promise it's not going to be noticeable. Now, sometimes I talk through this and people are like, oh, I'd rather just do all at one time. This is way too much switching it up. That's what's great about quilting. You can definitely do what you find more efficient or, what you find helpful for you. So one thing to remember, you're always going to transition in the direction that you're heading. So if I'm heading to this side, I'm always going to touch that side of the border. And depending on the number of borders you have, you might have to use stitching in the ditch to, get to the next part. So if I end up down here and I'm like, oh, I need to be up there, then you could stitch along that seam. It's a perfect example of how I love to use stitching in the ditch to maneuver my way around an area. I think it's much better for me mentally than cutting thread. So just a couple tips. If you're working on this idea or you're kind of like thinking about, trying this out, just try maybe in a border or two, and I think you'll find that it's pretty easy. You just have to kind of know where you need to end up and figure out how to get there. So the good thing is most designs can be quilted so that they touch the edge. So if you're going to try this technique, there's a lot that you can use. For instance, ribbon candy, wishbones, we've already seen that. Serpentine lines already touch, but even a swirl can touch if I make it look like it's running into the seam ever so slightly. And that's going to be my transition in and out. Now that's for thinner borders. If you're working on those larger borders, you're probably maybe going to have more of a focal element. If that's the case, use the echoing or the filler to transition in and out. So you might find that doing this with bigger borders could be a little bit easier. So not to make it too confusing, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. So do I want to quilt multiple borders, and do I want them to touch so I can transition in and out? Again, if I'm on my long arm, I can do part of my border, move right into my center of my quilt, come on over to this part of the border, advance, and then work my way back. All right. But you can also quilt or pick designs that can be broken. So I was trying to think of a clever way to say this in a smaller area. But basically, instead of quilting one continuous design, can I quilt it in sections, right? So is it something that can be broken up so I don't have to do it at once? So let's go back to my long arm example. If I am, working my way down the borders, I'm gonna have to quilt it in sections. Can I break it up and make it work out that way? So breaking it up into sections and being able to touch the edge will help you transition in and out of that border. Now, some designs can be quilted so that they join together and look as though they're one continuous design. We talked about the swirl chain in the last free motion challenge quilting along, and even though this whole design looks continuous, it's quilted in sections, so I can hop in and out, back and forth of that design. Using that that filler around it, the back and forth lines, that is my ticket to getting in there, adding my next section, and getting right back out. The paisley feather is another good example. But some designs don't really work out quite that way, right? If I think of a nice, beautiful, ornate feather, I can quilt that in sections, but it's really difficult to hook right in and make it look right. I've tried, it doesn't quite work out. So if I'm gonna do a really kind of ornate, beautiful feather, that means I need to either quilt in sections by breaking thread and getting over there, or I need to figure out a slightly different way to go about it. And what I'll do is I'll quilt these designs so that they run off the edge. So this particular quilt is just one that I kind of found. Even though it's a smaller quilt, it kind of shows you what I'm talking about. If I quilt a feather, if I think, I really want to put a feather, I love doing feathers, if I want to do that, but I don't want to have to quilt it continuously, running it off the edge is going to give me that transition so that I can easily get into the next area. Now here's the trick though. If I do it on one border, I'm going to make sure I do it on all four borders so that it looks intentional. So on the long arm, doing that horizontal border is no problem, but I don't want to do that all continuously and then break it up into chunks on the sides. I want to make it look like it's an artistic element to the quilt. I mean, don't you love the way it just runs off the edge? It adds a little bit of juxtaposition. I don't know. I'm just making up words, but the idea is it's a lot easier. So here in the I Love You, I just kind of quilted it so it ran off the edge and then came back. So let's see this in another quilt, a little bit more of an example. This is the Bjorn Bear quilt I did for Tula, and it didn't have borders, but I kind of treated the outside as though it were, and there was a lot of negative space. And so as I was kind of working my way down, I was thinking, oh, let's do some feathers that run off the edge. So here we can see a little bit up close. See how that feather is running into the bear and then coming out the other side? Isn't that fun? It makes the bear really pop out to the front, really pushes down the background. But now you know my secret and you know why I did that, right? It's gonna break it up into chunks and make it easier to quilt it. In this particular example, it's running into the edge of the quilt and it's running into the block, but run it into another design, whatever. And you can, if you want, overthink this and plan it out, totally fine. I just kind of eyeball it and decide where I want it to go and then quilt it in those chunks. Again, if you're thinking I'm still learning how to backtrack on the feathers, don't worry about this, but there is a way to quilt designs so that you can be really efficient about it, and that is my favorite way to go about it. All right, here's another example. Hopefully, the picture's you can't see the quilting quite so great, but here's this feather, again, running off the edge. I also use this idea to fit designs into borders that aren't the right size. So this border was, I think, like 4 inches. Not big enough for a feather, but I just shoved it in there and made it run off the edge. So you can definitely break that design up into chunks by running it to the edge, as long as you make it look intentional. So if you do it once, do it several times, make it look like you mean to do it, and then it'll look good. But what if you don't want to do that? Like, okay, I don't want to quilt it continuously, but I don't want to run it off the edge. What you can do is use the quilting to break up your border into sections. So it's kind of similar but different, right? So let's say I want to do a design that can't really be joined, like long echo lines. I love the look of straight echo lines, but on the long arm, doing those vertical lines are a pain. So for instance, this particular quilt, the Shattered Frames quilt, has all these borders, and I wanted to do some echoing, so let's see how I handled that. So I wanted the straight lines because I like a little bit of contrast to the wavy, but going down those long straight lines down the whole side is no fun. So what I did is every so often I threw in a couple serpentine lines. So those serpentine lines are basically providing a section for me to fill in, right? So I have some up here and some down there. Now I have a defined area to fill in, and it gives me that transition in and out. So I'm using the quilting to break it up. I'm making it look like it's fun and a different design, but I'm really just doing that because it's easier to quilt instead of advancing the quilt back and forth. So you can use any designs together. So here I'm doing serpentine lines with straight lines, but I could quilt a feather so it runs off, like creates my section, anything like that. So really kind of a fun way to do it. And I have another example. It's kind of the same idea. Straight lines are just those that cannot be joined. They're just a pain. So here's just some straight lines breaking it up. But I can do this with feathers, any design that I have a hard time joining together and making it look good. So I can do something like that and make it a little bit easier. Plus, for those of you, if there's any long armors out there that quilt for customers, this will make it so much more efficient, and then you can tell them that you did an extra bit of custom work, but you didn't charge them any extra for it. I always like to say that because obviously it was quicker for me. So you can break it up into sections. So I know that's like a quick little blurb about how to approach the borders, but just know that you can make it efficient or as efficient as you like. So if you're quilting it and you're like, I just want to do wishbones and I want to finish that border and I want to mark it off my list, perfect. But you can also break it up into chunks or use the quilting to create spaces to fill in. So try it out on some of your next quilts, and I'd love to hear what you think about that. But let's talk about turning the corner. It's all fun and games till it's time to turn the border corner. It's funny because even Karen said, I have a fear of turning the corner, please help. She said that in the chat before we started. So turning the corner can be a little tricky, right? Because you're just trying to get into the mode of quilting, the design, and then now you have to think about turning the corner. Well, you do have a couple options. I always have I'll call it cheating, although I think now the word is hack, so it's my border hacks. First, quilt a different design in the corner. Don't turn the corner. Just treat it like a square and fill it in with something else. This is one of my favorite things to do, especially if the design is very difficult to turn. Think ribbon candy. I love quilting ribbon candy. It's not the easiest to turn the corner, so I might quilt a swirl or a square or something in that corner and then just move on the other side. But you can also take the time to quilt it so that it wraps around an area. This is really going to be cool if the effect that you are going for is like a framing effect. Like you really want this beautiful ornate swirl chain, for example, to turn the corner and really just kind of, give it that frame, then you're going to want to turn the corner. So tips for that, if you're going to quilt it so that it wraps around, and I talk about this in the Borders and Background Challenge, so you can check it out. Also in the Machine Quilting with Rulers Challenge, because I do a little bit of that. When I'm looking at my border corner, I'm imagining that there's a line connecting the inner corner and the outer corner of my border. I'm not going to turn direction until my design crosses that line. That's important because sometimes we get nervous and we turn too soon, and then we have this big area over here to fill in. Now, if that happens, just fill it in, add some echoes, a different filler, just make sure you do it on another corner so it looks intentional. But aiming for that line and then changing direction will help you kind of split the difference of that corner and kind of keep it somewhat symmetrical. The tricky part about the border corner is that it has more area, right? So now you're filling in a bigger space, and then, so if you're quilting your feathers, sometimes, you're like, oh, I gotta make my feathers a little bigger, but try not to obsess too much about it. Really, it's just as easy as going over and then changing direction. But imagine you have that line and it will help you do that. Or you could just quilt the design so that it runs off the edge. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples. This in the quilted sample is the herringbone design. We learned this in the Borders and Backgrounds. It's great because I can break up my border into chunks, I can fill it in and then quilt. So it's going to allow me to kind of quilt as I go, kind of let me, handle it when I'm there or transition in and out. But what about the corner? So here's a couple examples that are in the handout from that video. I could put something completely different in the corner. So on the top example, I have my back and forth lines, but in that border corner, I just did a square that echoes in on itself. Really easy, nothing to sweat about, nothing to worry about, and then continuing on. This particular design doesn't really turn the corner. I mean, I guess you could do some diagonal lines. So for me, that wasn't really an option. I didn't want to change the look of the design that much, especially since this design is all about the texture. So I just quilted one side so that it ran off the edge and then came back and started the next border. In that instance, we're just pretending that the border is a rectangle this way and a rectangle that way and just filling in the area. So you might find it's easier to not turn the corner and you might still have the same beautiful effect. So when you're looking at your borders, just kind of think about how you want to go about it, and I promise one of those options are going to work. And think about, how fun it would be just to give it a pop of a different texture. So just because it's easier doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, right? So I think sometimes doing the easy option is the fun way to go about it. So that is, in summation, a class I teach over 6 hours in person. So I know it's kind of like a summary, but you can definitely download the PDF and it will kind of show you, you'll have those things to refer to. Again, as you approach your borders, try not to obsess too much about it. It's going to be great, especially if you're using a blending thread. So let's talk about questions. I had a few that I wrote down. I'm sure I see Jessica over there writing a bunch of questions down, so that's good. Mary said, how close to the edge do I quilt? Right, so if I'm quilting an outer border, how close to the edge do I quilt? Do I leave that 1/4 inch for binding? So it depends. It's totally up to you. I know that I probably am not going to bind my quilt, so I don't worry too much about that. If it is a focal element, let's say it's a feather or it's a big beautiful swirl chain that I want to be its own kind of thing, I'm actually going to quilt it so that it's a good 1/2 inch away from the edge. That's because sometimes, either if I'm quilting it for somebody or myself, sometimes I have to creatively trim my quilts so that it ends up square. So if that's the case, I try not to get it too close to the edge so it gives me a little bit of wiggle room to trim up my quilt. Then in that space, I'm going to use echoing or filler to fill it all the way to the edge. So I do always quilt all the way to the edge and off the edge, but it's not going to be the main element. It's going to be like a filler or echo lines or something like that. However, if it's a design like the wavy design, which is one that I teach in the Borders Challenge, that one has a lot of texture and a lot of wavy lines. It doesn't matter. I just quilt it right up to the edge and add more lines into it, and I know that when it trims up, it's going to look good. So it depends. If it is a focal element, I'll give it some space. If it's a swirl or an all over or something like that, then I'll leave it a 1/2 inch. The one difference there is, though, is what if it's a thinner outer border like wishbones? So I have kind of both things there, right? I have a design I don't really want to cut off because it will look weird, or I don't want to leave the space unquilted. So sometimes I have to pick one or the other, maybe pick a different design or just leave that space unquilted so that the binding doesn't cover it up. Totally depends on you, though. Mary Rose had a good question too. She said, I don't know whether to stitch around the outside of the border before I quilt it or after. She's tried both and she's not sure which one is best. The answer is it doesn't matter. You can do either one, before or after. I will say though, on a long arm, I will stitch on the side before I fill it in. So I'm going to stabilize the sides and then fill it in. So I'm not going to stitch down that outer border all the way down and then come back. I'm just going to stitch it before I fill it in. But on a sit-down machine, I might want to stitch it down so that I don't have to worry about quilting my foot into it. You can do either way, and sometimes I change it up a bit, but for the most part, I do it before, but I don't do the whole thing before and then fill it in. I'm doing it in chunks. So hopefully that makes sense. What's great is I always say, if it works, it works, right? If it works for you, you feel good about it, then do it. All right, so now lots of questions. So great to have you, Jessica, because I would always miss these before, so very fun. All right, what design works best for quilting narrow borders? Those are the worst, like 1/2 inch to 1 inch border. You're like, I can't fit anything in here. So sometimes I'll leave them unquilted. If it's a 1/2 inch, just kind of give it a little pop. But can you imagine the issue with that? There's no transition in between. So sometimes I'm like, oh, I need a transition so that I can, get to the other side or work my way in and out. So for those, I might do just a gently loopy line. I might do, that's probably about it. Maybe a wiggly line or a bracket shape. And sometimes a serpentine line, depending on how much quilting I'm wanting. But if it's a narrow border, there's usually more. For some reason, people that love doing borders will just put a bunch on there. So there's not usually just one narrow border and then the quilt's done. Sometimes I'll hook it into a bigger border. So let's say I have my quilt and I have my cute little inner border and then I have my outer border. I might just treat both borders as one and quilt the design in it. So sometimes that makes it a little easier. Where it gets tricky though is when somebody does like black border, white border. That's a problem, right? Because I'm probably going to change thread colors, and that would be a perfect example of when I wouldn't break it up into chunks. On the bear quilt, did I mark where I wanted the feathers before quilting? What answer do you want to hear? In the beginning, or when I started quilting, I probably would have marked out the spine just to see where it goes, but I quilted that in the long arm so I could kind of see where it was going, and I just quilted the spine and filled it in. I will tell you though, there is a little bit of repetition that happens naturally. So I quilt on a Handy Quilter Avante. It has an 18-inch throat. So on the side borders, my feathers, for some reason, are always about 15 to 16 inches long. That's because I want to work in my throat space. So that does kind of create some repetitiveness. But the idea that it's wandering off and on means that it's kind of, I hate to say it, but organic. But you could definitely mark it out beforehand. I wouldn't mark the whole feather. I would just mark a registration line so that I can see where it's going. I'm almost done with a quilt I'm doing for Tula right now that's a butterfly. And so that particular quilt, I'm quilting these really fun feathers that come up like antenna, but they curl in on each other. So I am marking those curls out, and I'm marking how far I want the petal to come out, like a reference line, and then I'm just going to freehand the rest. So I do like to mark those reference lines, and depending on how symmetrical I really want to look or how nervous I am about it, I'll put lots more reference lines. But to take the time to mark out the whole design can be distracting, and it will be hard to see where to go. So that's how I handle that. And I even answered a question that wasn't asked. So there we go. Can I add more batting on the border to make it fuller? This is a little tricky. So either you're talking about putting one layer and then cutting a different section and just putting it there, or you're talking more like trapunto, which is a whole nother thing. Sure, you can. I'm sure you can add more batting on the border to make it fuller. I don't know if I would. It just seems like a hassle, but who knows? Or you can go for a loftier batting that might help you get that puffiness. It's up to you. I know I've heard quilters talk about adding borders after they quilt it, so it could probably be something like that. So my answer is, I'm sure you can. I just never done it. If you have, leave it in the comments below and answer that question for me. That would be very, very helpful. How do I make sure one design does not touch another and get lost? Okay, so this is where you start to see really kind of how much I overthink quilting. It's kind of funny because everywhere else in my life I'm super relaxed, whatever, but I love to obsess about quilting. So I have a rule. This is just my own rule. I never quilt the same design next to itself. I know, it's weird. So if I have multiple borders, I won't do wishbone, wishbone, wishbone. To me, first of all, I get bored easily, you know this. And so I'm going to do something different that will help keep them from getting lost in each other. Picking a design that has contrast. So let's say I have those 3 borders that we saw, and let's say it's 3 borders, but they're kind of different shades of gray or whatever. They're not like super different. Then, alternating between wishbone and ribbon candy would be fun. But let's pretend it was like very striking different fabric, black and white or whatever. I'll do something that contrasts with the other designs. So I might do wishbones, and then I might do straight lines. So kind of like that quilt where we saw the broken frames and stuff. That's kind of what I was going for. But that's when it gets to be a little tricky doing those straight lines. So that would be a perfect example of why I would do it. Also, changing up the scale of a design. So maybe quilting one design slightly bigger than the other will help give it enough contrast. Or if it's like a sashing and there's like cornerstones, I'll definitely echo the side before I fill it in. That is kind of a really easy go-to idea that gives it a little bit more of a custom look. So let's say I have, this isn't for borders, but let's say I have sashings, I might do ribbon candy, and then I'll echo the side and I'll add a wishbone in there. That little bit of echoing just helps separate it, and it looks really nice, although it doesn't take that much longer. I have a great picture. I have a quilt that's coming to mind, so I'll try to remember to show it next week on the live chat. I think you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. What if I want to turn a corner with a continuous design? That's like saying, give me the most difficult plant to keep alive. I can do it. Totally fine, you can. I'm just going to quilt it so it wraps around. So continuous to me means a design that, whether it's quilted in one pass or not, it's makes one design, like a feather, right? So I'm going to quilt that spine of my feather so that it hits that diagonal line that I'm imagining between the inner and outer corner. And then I'm using the petals to fill it up. If I'm doing let's say a wishbone, I didn't go over this, so it's a good question. If I'm doing a wishbone, I'll use that inner border corner to turn. I'll kind of rotate. So that corner will go 1, 2, 3, and then continue on. If that doesn't make sense, be sure to check out some of those challenge videos from the Borders and Backgrounds, because I talk about that a little bit. Pivoting versus turning. So you can definitely do it. Just don't stress out about it when you get there. Kind of think through your next path, or maybe mark out just the corner and quilt. I promise it's going to be fine. What do I need to do if my thread is getting bunched up in the back? Okay, so you're quilting along, everything is great, and then you have a thread issue. I hate when that happens. There is nothing that will make me madder than that. Pause real quick, I'm sorry. Hey Jex, there is a power strip back there that is behind that. Will you flip the light on? My battery's about to go dead on my camera. Nope, the next one behind there. There you go, behind, by the window. Anyway, hold on one second. I'm gonna go do some real quick. I know this is weird, but I didn't make sure it was turned on. Okay. I'm just sitting here watching my battery go die. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can imagine if the computer dies. Sorry guys, that's what's fun about live, right? Live, yay. Okay. But I was talking about turning the corner, bunched up in the back. So you're quilting along, everything is great, and the thread gets bunched up in the back. It can be a number of things. It could be the fact that it's, the thread isn't feeding properly. It could be a lot of different stuff. So try rethreading your machine, and then cleaning it out will really help. It's probably a bobbin issue. Okay, real quick before we end, today's promo is all about panel play. So check out the link in the description box below, and you can get 20% off the patterns or the kits or any of that. Just type in the promo code live chat border, and you can check that out. Also, another thing I really like to use for borders is a stencil to break it up. So very, very fun. Well, lots of questions. Hey, if you like to live chat, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up or leave a comment. I love to answer questions. And I'll see you next week when we'll talk about quilting with swirls. All right, so until then, everybody stay cool, try not to get overheated, and I'll see you next week. Until then, happy quilting.